Today we are going to discuss about barriers in business communication. So in this next few minutes we are going to talk about many kinds of barrier like semantic barriers, emotional barriers, organizational barrier and personal barriers. So friends, before we talk about different types of barriers, let's discuss and understand what barriers are. So barrier to business communication. So before that, I would request you to recall that what business communication is. Communication in general is to communicate, any idea, any thought, any concept you may have in your mind. So there's a sender and there's a receiver. So the sender sends the message to the receiver. If receiver receives it in the very same manner, what does the sender has in his or her mind, then there's no barrier. It means the message is transmitted as it is. It is received without any hurdle. But that doesn't happen all the time. If the message is not received in the very same manner, the meaning is distorted, the quality of the message is distorted, it means there was some hurdle, right? So this difference between the message which is communicated and the message which is received by the receiver, that difference is basically barrier, right? So that decides the quality. So the difference is because the quality of communication was not up to mark, was not effective, right? This gap, the extent of this gap or the degree of this gap will depend upon what was the nature of the barrier and what was the extent of the barrier, right? So the nature and the extent of the barrier will decide the quality of communication. This very rule is applicable for business communication as well, right? So I hope you are clear by what does it mean if we refer to the term barriers to business communication or hurdles to business communication. Okay, so any obstacle which reduces the quality of the message transmitted is barrier. Okay, so our purpose is to look for those hurdles, those obstacles and to minimize it. Anybody who is concerned about the effectivity of the communication, right? Anybody, sender or receiver both, they should be actually able to identify hurdles or the obstacle which can probably reduce the quality of the message. Now we shall be talking about these types of barriers. As I said, we intend to cover all the 4 types of barriers today in this session. The first one is semantic barriers, then emotional and psychological barriers, organizational barriers and personal barriers. So let's take the first one first, semantic barriers. Now semantic barriers means they are at the superficial level. They are something which are in the surroundings, in the environment. So there are a couple of examples. We will take one by one. The first is symbols with different meaning. One person showing thumbs up is it could be simply that I'm appreciating the effort, so I'm showing the thumbs up. But that same thumbs up, if it is shown like this, it becomes that I'm appreciating. But if we actually wave our thumb, it means we are actually kind of denying, or we are actually embarrassing the person, the recipient, right? So the same symbol may have different meaning for different times. So not only that, sometimes the symbols are same in a particular geographical area. The same symbol may have a different meaning in different location. It could be a different state, a different city or different country, right? So this use of symbol when is being made, and if the symbols have different meaning for the recipient and for the sender, that becomes the semantic barrier. This particular barrier would be known as semantic barrier. Now the badly expressed message. Sometimes, we expressed badly. So the message was different, but the expression was not up to mark, right? So if I say, I will do it, this is a nice way. I will do it. You can note the difference. My expression in the second time, when I attempted, the second time, so the language was same. The words were same, that I will do it. But in the first time, the first expression, I am saying I will do it. And second time I am saying I will do it. So as if I am conveying very, aggressively, which means I am annoyed. Maybe there was some pressure on me. Somebody told me to do your work, which I do not intend to do. Something like that. So my expression was badly used here, and the message doesn't carry the same meaning. So the person to whom I am telling like this, that I will do it, actually would be skeptical on my action. He may not believe my action, that I may do it, I may not do it. I said though, but I may not mean it, right? So my message is already distorted, already perceived as negative. So though I said a positive thing. So this particular barrier is semantic barrier. So where is the badly expression? Then sometimes the translation of the message is faulty. So this particular barrier or the hurdle comes on the end of a sender. The sender translated it differently. And the receiver took it differently. So this faulty translation could be either of the two, but for most of the time the translation is made by the receiver, the person who is receiving the message, right? So the receiver may translate it faulty, with some fault, right? So for example, certain cultures have a different way of congratulating somebody, and certain cultures have a different way. Or for example, there are cultures where white color is worn during weddings, and there are cultures where white color is been worn to mourn, right? So this is just an expression. This is not the translation example, but that is also how that that color was translated. So without knowing, I wore a particular color in somebody's wedding. I wasn't aware that black color is not considered good in the wedding. So that black color is, that message translated faulty. They assume that I am not happy for them, I have bad will, I have ill will, whereas the intention of the person was simply, person was not aware of this is a good example to illustrate the culture as well as the translation. The translation especially comes it when the written language is there, or when somebody said vocal. So we may translate it differently. I am not very good in for example Chinese, right? And your message was in Chinese language. So I have some knowledge, but I wasn't able to make same meaning what you wanted to communicate. So I translated it differently. So there are people, for example, pronunciation is something people may not be able to read it and understand it as well. Comprehension, comprehend. These are the few words like so we may not assume that everybody who is not very good in English or very well familiar with English language may be able to use it in the same manner, right? So stationery, somebody just used the wrong language. Stationery is the stable, something stable, and stationery, I just said stationery, so I didn't communicate in written. I said stationery, right? So my meaning of stationery was stable. Somebody took it stationery, the loose staple pens and all that stationery we use in office, right? So because the pronunciation is almost same, stationery and it has been translated different way. So there was a fault in translation that becomes a barrier, and this particular barrier is known as semantic barrier. Then we certainly, everybody has assumption about different situations, different people, different workplaces, different cultures of organizations. So sometimes there are unqualified assumptions, right? Qualified assumptions are proven one. We know, everybody knows it. In accounting, we have qualified assumption. Right? There are certain unqualified assumptions. So even that becomes a semantic barrier. Then another very important, aspect of barrier is that sometimes people who are communicating, they forget that they are dealing with a person who doesn't come from their fraternity, from their field. A lawyer may use legal language in general communication. People like me who are accountant may use a different language in the communication, and somebody who is not familiar with accounting may not be able to understand what I am trying to say, because I am using specialist language. Doctors, for example, a very good example. Doctors have, we say BP बढ़ गया है. You may have seen your parents, family member using it. My BP is disturbed, my BP बढ़ गया है. But in actual, doctors do not use the word BP. They do not write BP. They actually write hypertension. Okay, and there may be more technical term for this, which I may not be aware of. So somebody who have never heard that particular term may not be able to understand what the doctor was trying to say. So there are specialist language for lawyers, for doctors, for chartered accountants, and many more peoples. That particular language may not be known to the receiver, and that becomes a barrier, and this particular barrier would be semantic barrier. Okay. Now we will talk about the second type of barriers. These are emotional and psychological barriers. So emotional barrier means they are related to the emotions of the receiver or the sender. So this has to do with the psychology of the receiver or of the sender. Okay. So the first example here is premature evolution. Somebody evolved, right? But somebody evolved little faster. So the evolving is premature. Okay. So that can actually lead to as a barrier, that can lead to distorting of the masses. Okay. Then we have inattention. So inattention means I am saying something, but the receiver, he is not in a mood to listen to you. He is lost somewhere else. So that's why we say the effective communication actually has a very important part in it, and that is listening. So listening is actually more important than speaking, than writing. So listening skills that's why are always been emphasized upon whenever we are talking about communication. So inattention, the lack of attention on the end of receiver or the giver, both. It's not only the person who is saying, who is sending the message. If I am sending the message and I am inattentive in what I am writing or what I am saying, right, I may not mean that. I may not use the appropriate language in my written or vocal communication, or even my expression, in general expression. So that inattention on the end of sender will give a different meaning to the receiver. Let's say I am saying something positively. I have no problem in my mind. I am very positive about something which I am saying, but I wasn't able to pay attention and look into the eyes of the receiver. So let's say there was a verbal communication going on. I did not think, I didn't pay attention that I need to communicate this message while looking at the person. I didn't look at the person's eyes. So the receiver could not be very sure about what I said actually, right? So sender, this inattention could be on the sender's end as well as receiver's end. But let's say another example, the sender was very attentive, he was sure what he or she is saying and said exactly with appropriate body language. So there was no distortion of message on his end. But on the other end, the receiver was not very attentive. He was lost in his thoughts, he was under stress, he was looking at his mobile and listening to you what you were saying. He was looking at a piece of paper and was listening to whatever you were saying. He was listening news on a TV channel and was listening to you as well what you were saying. You know, it happens in families. Wives have general complaint that the husband doesn't pay attention, and they complain he's always inattentive. Means whenever she's saying something, if husband is still watching the TV and is just nodding head or so then the person who's actually saying something, and here I'm taking the example the wives on a lighter side, so they feel this is the receiver was inattentive, and this can actually become a barrier in the communication. This is a reality, right? So it's not only for husbands, it's equally true for wives or in any relationship, anywhere, a teacher, a student, friends, parents, anybody. If you're dealing with a public officer, any executive, etc., etc., so inattention actually leads to hurdle, leads to ineffective communication. So this is known as emotional barrier, because you have some stress, you have a particular emotion in mind, you are sad, you have a fear, you are angry, and because of that you are inattentive. So you could be inattentive because of any of the emotion that we do not know. You simply do not like the person. So the person is saying something to you and you are inattentive because you don't give a damn to that person. Simple, right? So that is an emotional barrier, that you have something in your mind, your heart about that person, and because of that you are inattentive, and this message is not going to reach to you whatever the message the sender wants to communicate, right? Then the next point under the emotional and psychological barriers are loss of transmission and poor retention. So this particular example fits in a situation when the receiver has poor retention and there was some loss of information during the transmission. So this happens with people who have some memory issue, people who are whose brain is underdeveloped, people who are simply not going through a good physical and mental health. So there's a loss of transmission, so they cannot retain the complete message. They may retain some part of it. Let's say I was walking through and I said we will have a meeting today afternoon in room number 224, right? The person who was there was an elderly person. His memory is not very great. He must be otherwise very intelligent person. So he could not remember it was 244, 242 or 241. He got confused, and it happens with us as well, not only with the elderly people. It happens for times then when the person was communicating, we were not attentive. So we were inattentive, and number one, and on the other hand, my retention is not great. So the both the things together becomes a deadly combination, right? It becomes a deadly combination because I was not inattentive on the one hand, on the second hand my retention is not that great, and certainly the message is not received the way it was said or communicated. All right, and what else could be there in emotional and psychological barrier? There's an undue reliance on the written word. Sometimes people take the word in the letter and spirit. They just take as it is. They do not take the intent. They just stick to the word. right? So too much of importance is given to the word or the language used in the message. Either it's a vocal, the verbal communication, or it's a written communication. If we give too much attention, or if we rely too much on the word I am saying, that I said it, I as a sender may say I have already communicated, but I may have said it, but my body language was not in congruence with what I said. My expressions were not, in congruence with what I said. Then it means I am just relying on the language, on the word I used, right? So if we give undue reliance or importance to the written word, so that also becomes a barrier in the communication. So another point is there's a distrust of communication. I was cheated by one shopkeeper. This is an example. In the past, let's say 6 months ago. After 6 months, I happened to visit that shopkeeper again to buy anything else. I have that memory in my mind, in the back of my mind, and I know that guy is not honest. He may quote something, he may show something, give something else. He may quote different price to different people. You have some idea. There's some distrust, in my mind already before I speak with the person. So that particular distrust, which is already there in my mind, becomes a hurdle in the communication. So that is an emotional or psychological. This is a very big psychological barrier. People whom we had bad experience in the past, we may not trust this time when they are communicating, and maybe this time the person is actually having the same meaning what he or she is saying, but even then I may not trust it, because there is a lack of trust, and that is an emotional psychological barrier, because this distorts the message. How well or how good the intention of the person is, the receiver is going to take it otherwise. And then we have a failure to communication. Another and the last example in this slide. Failure to communication means what? Right? So I have emotions. I was crying at a particular moment of time, and in that sphere of moment, I could not say what I want to say. I kept on saying everything else but what I wanted to say, right? So there was a failure to communication because I was under so much stress. You may have heard it. Sometimes people, if they see at a thief, they could not speak even help. They could not speak loudly. They were not able to utter the word help. They were not able to say something simply because they were under so much of fear, right? So there's absolutely failure to communicate anything under certain emotional or psychological condition. That particular condition also is known as a barrier to the communication. That actually becomes a barrier to the communication. You were trying to say, but you were you were kind of whispering. The other person could not hear. You were whispering under some pressure, under some fear. You were not able to say loudly, right? And that becomes barrier to the communication. I hope, friends, you were able to gather both cementing and as well as emotional barrier to business communication. Thank you for being with us. Thanks.